I thought we might spend a bit of time talking about AI and ethics. You're one of the world's leading experts in this space. We're at a fascinating time at the moment in Australia where we've had an enormous amount of new regulation in the data space over the last few years, and a lot of potential regulation on the horizon. There have been a number of reports, the ACCC Digital Platforms Inquiry final report, and we have consumer data right on the horizon that are introducing into various sectors potentially some really significant changes to the way in which we deal with data, the way in which we might deal with ethics. And I know you being at the intersection of data and ethics and AI, I'm fascinated to hear what you see as the emerging trends around the world and how they're being dealt with.
Yeah, it's certainly like a very peculiar moment, because we, as societies, we come to realize the tremendous potential of data in connection to AI. There is a wealth of things that we can do, and among those things, some are very unethical or something that we really don't want to end up with: discrimination, bias, decision, and so on and so forth. One of the trends that we see emerging is the need to exploit the value of data for many good uses, whether would this be philanthropic or shaped by social good or commercial, but also the increasing awareness of the risks that some of these uses might bring about for individuals and for societies. And there is a growing will and a growing effort to coordinate expertise, but also stakeholders around this double need, if you wish, so opportunities versus risks, to harness the opportunities and mitigate the risk. And this is true for the private sector, which of course has learned through a series of backlashes that overlooking ethical aspects, overlooking ethical risks can harm business. But it's also true for the regulator, who has learned that intervening too hard or too strictly on the data management, collection and access can actually hamper innovation and then harm society. And so it's trying to understand what is the right pace, the right strength that they need to enforce. And this is also something that consumers or users or citizens are learning, because they come to understand that their privacy, for example, has a value. And most of the services that we thought we could access for free are actually services that we're paying with our own data. And this can lead to a series of advantages. I often mention, being able to move around Melbourne, not knowing the city because of your apps, but might also lead to some serious problems further down the line in terms of profiling, being discriminated, or just being offered services at higher prices, or being cut out from possible services and opportunities in the future. So the trend is really trying to convene interest, convene effort, and coordinate them, so to find a kind of a harmonious solution for what it is. A complex problem is not a trivial one, so it requires a lot of effort to be addressed properly.
And in terms of finding that balance, I think, and that tension that you talked about and resolving that, should we be looking to governments to be leading the direction here and putting in place laws specifically dealing with AI, dealing with ethics and the intersection with data, or should we be looking to industry and potentially peak industry bodies to be dealing with these issues and putting forward, for example, voluntary codes, potentially certification type regimes, or should we be looking perhaps at a combination of the two?
I think it's a combination of the two that is really the way of addressing this issue. So AI is a transformative technology. It's changing the way we do things and the way we understand things. And this has a huge potential, but also comes with huge risks. Now, governments or public institutions, they really have the responsibility to shape the use of this technology and the use of these transformations according to the values of our societies. But it would be problematic to think that it's up to them to implement these changes and to give to decide autonomously the shape of these changes. Their role, I think, is more into the convening power again and making sure that there are infrastructures, there are institutions where discussion can be held, and then the consequences and the output of this discussion can be actually put to some use. So we need to have some serious regulations which define the boundaries of this discussion, but I also think that some room has to be left for experimenting or for voluntary codes, or for decisions to be made by the other stakeholders, which are not just the private sectors, but we can think of NGOs, we can think of citizens, we can think of particular sectors among a population of a country. So we need to make sure that we have regulation there, but also that we have a room where discussions can be held and fine-grained solution for specific problem can be defined with a dialogue and with a discussion. A top-down regulation, a top-down down direction would do more harm than good, I think. We have to remember that we want to protect users' rights, we want to have technology to be developed according to cultural values, but we also want to harness the value of technologies, which means innovation, which means experimenting sometimes. So it's coordinating all these aspects, which is really the big responsibility that a state or a government or a public institution has.
There's been a real shift, I think, in thinking both from a regulatory perspective and also from a commercial perspective in this country, focusing more on consumer expectations and then the ethics associated with the use of data. So we're starting to see a number of organisations, their chief data officer is now their chief data and ethics officer, or chief ethics officers being introduced. How do you think at a practical level those sorts of issues should be dealt with within organisations?
So indeed, there are more and more companies who have a chief ethics officer or chief and data ethics officer, and I think it's a good step into the right direction. There is a space which laws and regulation leave open, which is what we call post-legal compliance, which has to do with ethical choices that companies have to make with respect to the users, the products that they develop, the markets they want to get in. And I think that the practical step there is for companies to take a stance, to define ethical codes to which they're going to abide, irrespective of regulations, irrespective of the opportunities that the lack of regulation might offer. We often find discussions about big digital companies being really acting on a global stage, and then regulation being different in different places. So in some places you find yourself respecting freedom of speech, in other places you don't. So if you were just to leave it to the rules, you will be behaving ethically in one place and less ethically in the other place. It's about the companies to decide which values should shape their services, and ethical values, and abide to those values. So I think the next step is really to come up with clear ethical principles and show to the users and customers that those principles are important and companies abide to those. Digital technologies have made evident a dynamic which was not so evident perhaps before, which is to work and to be competitive and be successful, you need users' trust. And trust relies on your reputation as a company, and your reputation stands on your behavior and your action. And that's where you want to act to make sure that the whole chain is not broken at any point. So I think that you're right, that voluntary codes or clear values for companies are the next step to be achieved.
Yeah. And I suppose following on from that, the question of who should bear the responsibility for the ethical use of data, you think it should then fall to the individual organisations, or should there be some sort of overarching responsibility that is taken perhaps?
So it's one property that data have is to be greasy or malleable, which makes it a difficult asset to manage, to collect, to manage and to share. So I think that ethical use of data is a phrase which is a kind of an umbrella phrase. It includes security access, it includes protection of privacy, it includes decisions about secondary uses. And this means that we have to have clear regulation with that respect. And we also need to have clear internal policies, and clear accountability path and transparency about these things. And I think that all of these aspects require responsibility from the public institutions and regulations, but also for the different stakeholders in that. It eventually goes down to the users who give access to its own data, perhaps unreflectively sometimes, but also to the company who keep the data. And in the UK, we recently had the ICO fining quite a huge amount of money to British Airways for a security leak. And I think that's interesting because it clearly identifies where the responsibility stays when it comes to the security of the data, which is not something unrelated to the ethics of data, because security is a way to open up to possibly unethical, unapproved uses of those data. So, for example, that gives you a sense of where responsibility is.
Yeah. Now, one of the things often we hear our clients talk about is GDPR being the gold standard, if you like, for data regulation, and particularly a number of our global clients are looking to roll out GDPR compliance programs globally and introducing it to a certain extent in Australia. Do you see perhaps GDPR as it might be developed? There's some ethics regulation as part of that to an extent, but do you see there being some leading piece of regulation that might ultimately be adopted, at least on a principles basis globally, or do you see it as being a fairly fragmented development? So
the GDPR is a good piece of regulation because it's the first one who really focuses on tries to capture the plethora of possible uses and problems that data can generate. It's also a very European-centered piece of regulation. It rests on the understanding of and the protection of human dignity as the groundwork on which we protect personal data. And this makes it a regulation which is really good for Europe, might not be good for other places where, for example, privacy is linked to freedom of speech, like the US. So I think that on the one side, the GDPR is really showing by example to the rest of the world why do we need to protect data and what are the problems that we need to address. Whether it will work globally, I'm not too sure. And I think it's also good to mention that we should really be careful when thinking about global regulations for technology and digital technologies, because global regulation would eventually mean that some values which are important in some corner of the world would not be respected because we import other values from other countries, perhaps those who are more digitally advanced. So I think that while there has to be some kind of harmonization on fundamental values, human rights, for example, we have to be prepared to see differences and even to foster differences where this means respecting cultural and local values. It's the only way in which we can think that then technology can be adopted and accepted by societies rather than being imposed on those societies as well.
And in terms of the nature of the regulation, certainly, for example, with privacy regulation in this country, there are often references to taking reasonable steps. So putting in that reasonableness element. Do you see AI regulation going down a similar path, so leaving a grey area, if you like, that could potentially change over time depending on the nature of AI solutions and the nature of technology as it changes?
So I think that there has to be some kind of soft areas within regulations because this technology, digital technology specifically, evolves at quite a fast pace, and we discover new opportunities and new problems as actually we go by with it. But I think that soft space is a space that is not for the hard law to cover. It's more for the governance processes and the policy processes. So that the kind of there are more malleable areas of regulations that we can think to work on, which can be updated much quickly and in response to what we see on a daily basis, perhaps. One of the biggest risks that we face these days is to have regulations which are very strict for fear of possible, justified fear of possible severe problems, which then hamper innovation. And the only way to mitigate this risk is to have regulations that give us, like the GDPR, a broad view, but then leave room for adjustment as we go by. It's a technology which has not yet shown its full potential, so we have to be able to intervene as it evolves.
And in terms of the technology itself, so from a regulatory perspective, for example, especially coming out of Europe, is this concept of explainability. So the extent to which you can almost look under the hood, if you like, to understand and have some explanation of how the solution is reached on the basis of the inputs. How do you see that working at a practical level? Because it seems to me that as the technology develops, there's going to be some real tension, I think, between being able to explain, to have that explainability element, but necessarily potentially getting value as the AI solutions become more complex.
No, explainability is an important problem to be addressed. There are two parts of it. One is a technical part. So some technology becomes more explainable as it evolves. So some forms of machine learning, for example, become less of a black box. Some form, even if less so, neural networks become less of a black box. Some others don't. And the answer to that, so to the technological part, is just to wait and see. But then there is another part, which is the regulatory, the ethical side of it, which makes the lack of explanation, the lack of transparency, kind of a boundary for the ethical uses of AI. We delegate to AI very sensible and sensitive decisions about health diagnosis, recruitment processes, who's going to get a mortgage and who won't. Those decisions are decisions who have a real impact on human life. And so it's up to us to understand that whether we want to delegate those decisions, which are so important, to machines which we don't really understand or predict. And for me, that's a very important ethical question. At which point is ethically unacceptable to do so, and at which point we can bear the compromise and say, well, actually, it's worth doing so. And it's an ethical decision there.